I invite you to join us for classes that we offer every month through the year. Coming up next on Wednesday, February 23rd, we will be having a class called Release and Recruit, Recovering the Resiliency of Native Streamside or Riparian Forests. Lance Wise of the Rogue River Watershed Council will be giving that class. And on Wednesday, March 9th, we will have the rescheduled class that had been originally scheduled for last December. It's going to be Firewise USA Principles, Protecting Homes from Wildfire. And that will be given by Herb Johnson, who is the coordinator of Firewise USA and the Fuels Reduction Grant. Fire is an important part of the ecology of Southwest Oregon and has been used by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial to keep the land healthy. Prescribed fire is a tool with many benefits: pasture improvement, biodiversity conservation, hazard reduction, and forest health. Until recently, it was used primarily on public lands, but it has become increasingly accessible to private landowners. Tonight's speakers will describe how and why fire is used, as well as ongoing efforts to make it accessible to all. Aaron Krikova is the organizer of the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association. He is a wildland firefighter who spends his off-season advocating for the increased use of prescribed burning on private land. And Dr. Chris Adlam is the regional fire specialist for Southwest Oregon with OSU Extension's fire program. He holds a PhD in fire ecology and works to empower local communities to live well with fire, including through the use of prescribed burning. And with that, I will turn it over to Chris and Aaron.
Thank you, Marcy. And hello, everybody. So today I'm going to go over first some generalities about prescribed burning, why it is used, and some of the options that are available to landowners who want to use it. And then Aaron is going to take over and talk about the Prescribed Burn Association that is starting up in the Rogue Valley, and we'll hear more about what that is and why it might be relevant to you. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And here we are. So could you please confirm you've seen this, Marcy? Somebody?
Yes.
Yes.
Good. Excellent. Thank you. So thanks for that great introduction, Marcy. I have an introduction slide, but you've heard a bit about me. My interests are in fire ecology, community-based fire management, and supporting tribes in the use of cultural burning. The fire program, the Extension Fire program that I belong to, is a fairly new program that was started in 2020. And we have a team of fire specialists across 6 different regions throughout Oregon, and I cover the region of Southwest Oregon, which is basically Douglas County and everything to the south of there. And what we do at the fire program involves helping people understand and apply the latest science when it comes to fire, supporting landscape and community level planning, and getting forest health treatments and prescribed fire on the ground. And we also work with our partners on state fire policy, which is actually an area where there's a lot going on right now, and a lot that is relevant to people who want to use prescribed fire. So we could talk about state fire policy and how that relates to fire, but I just want to let you know that there's a lot that's changing. And so what we're telling you today, this is the best of our knowledge today, but we're hoping also that through changes at the state level and also the federal level, we can actually see an increase in the use of prescribed fire by removing some of the obstacles that exist currently. So, like I said, one of my interests is fire ecology, and I could talk all day about how fire affects different aspects of the environment and different species. But we're going to have to go through fairly quickly on the benefits of prescribed fire today. I'm sort of assuming that you are interested in the use of prescribed fire, and that I'm not going to work to convince you. But briefly, here are some of the benefits of prescribed fire. First of all, the ecological benefits. Fire in the Rogue Valley historically was extremely frequent and common. Going back pre-colonization, we have a fire return interval of about 8 years between fires across the Rogue Basin, okay? And some places, grasslands, lower elevation, oak woodlands, maybe even more often, 3 to 5 years, and some areas may be a little bit longer, but about every 8 years, pretty much the entire Rogue Valley would burn. So if you think about that, one part at a time, obviously not all at once, but you think about that, that's a lot of fire. This tree here on the left is a dead pine tree that is on private land in the Applegate Valley. And Erin and I were actually out at this property visiting with the landowners who wanted to do a prescribed burn, and we found this tree. And if you look carefully, there's this inverted V-shaped scar, which we call a cat face scar, and it's caused by successive fires that have left a mark on this tree. So you see all those red arrows. If you look carefully inside of that cat face scar, on the left, that's the oldest fire scar that you can see. And then there are all these layers, one on top of the other. So each time a fire came through, it would burn the part of the tree, and then the tree would try to grow over that. And then another fire would come through, and it would make another scar, and then another scar and another scar. So you can see there are about 15 scars that are visible on this cat face. And you can see that some of the layers are very thin. That means that these fires were burning very frequently, probably only a couple of years or maybe 3 to 5 years between successive fires. And of course, the most recent would be probably mid-1800s, before the removal of indigenous people from this area. And so, of course, because fire was so common, a lot of species are adapted to frequent fire. And these wildflowers are an example of what you see after a burn. A lot of flowers are really adapted to fire and respond very well to a prescribed fire. Next, of course, we use prescribed fire for fuel reduction. So this photo on the left is a landowner, again in the Applegate Valley, a different landowner who hired a contractor last year to do a prescribed burn right around their house, and reducing the risk that a wildfire would come and burn up the slope into their house. On the right, you see a picture from the Bootleg Fire area. This is the Black Hills Project. It's a partnership between the Klamath tribes, the Nature Conservancy, and the US Forest Service. And they burnt this area before the fire burnt through the area. And this is now the only place where you basically have green trees for miles around. So you can see all of the trees here are still green. So when the fire came through, the Bootleg Fire, it just didn't have enough to burn to create enough heat to kill these older trees. And lastly, for forest health and climate adaptation. So, climate change is putting a lot of pressure on our forests. We're seeing especially a lot of mortality in Douglas firs in the area. And prescribed fire is one of several tools that we use to kind of reduce competition amongst the trees and move the forest towards more drought and fire tolerant species like these pines and oaks and madrones. And I could go on. There are other reasons people use prescribed fire. People burn pastures to improve the nutritional quality for their animals, bring on the grass earlier in the spring, and get rid of invasive plants like yellow star thistle and medusa head. And of course, indigenous people use fire for the purpose of managing plants that are important to their culture, basketry plants, food plants, to attract wild animals. And in some parts of the country, people use prescribed fire for game animals, such as deer and elk and quail and other game birds. So there are a lot of reasons why people use prescribed fire, and we could talk about that all day, but we're going to have to go through that pretty quickly. So if you're interested in prescribed fire, you probably still have a lot of questions. Most of us have never seen a prescribed fire. And so even if you think, you've read about it and it sounds like a good idea, it's normal to have a lot of questions. One of the questions is, of course, about risk. You're setting your land on fire. Isn't that dangerous? Well, the risk of a prescribed fire causing damage is really small. Less than 1% of prescribed fires escape. And when they do escape, they usually stay a very small size. So they might get out of the project area, but they are only going to burn maybe a couple of acres without causing any substantial damage. It's very rare that, the worst case scenario of destroying some neighbor's property is extremely rare. So it's very rare that a fire escapes. When they do escape, it's very rare that they cause damage. And lastly, even when they do cause damage, it's actually quite rare that lawsuits are brought against the people who were responsible for that prescribed fire. For example, in California, a recent review found 2 cases where there were charges brought against people who had prescribed burns that escaped in all of history of using prescribed fire in California. And in both cases, it was absolutely egregious conduct. We're talking about burning a different area than what was on the permit and things like that. So all in all, the risk is very low, and we live in a high fire danger area. I would say that the risk of a wildfire coming onto your land and causing damage because you didn't do a prescribed fire is possibly greater than the risk of doing a prescribed fire that goes badly. That's my opinion. I don't have numbers on that, but that's my feeling. Next thing is that there's, of course, many things that you can do to make sure that a prescribed fire stays safe. And some of the practices that practitioners use are obviously writing a burn plan that explains why this burn is taking place, how it's going to take place, what all the steps are, under what conditions this needs to happen, what conditions would not be appropriate. People get the appropriate permits from ODF in particular, the Oregon Department of Forestry. They have enough resources on site. So maybe you need a couple of engines and a certain number of personnel. Talking to your neighbors is very important, letting them know what you're doing, watching the weather in case it changes, and also very important, keeping track after the burn, after most people go home, making sure that you don't have a flare up or something happening because of the wind picking up, for example. Another question people have is, well, thinning is a lot of work. Isn't it enough to just thin the forest? Can't we just thin and be done? Do we also have to burn? Unfortunately, the answer is that it is usually better to use prescribed fire following a thinning treatment. And this scientific paper explains why. They said, one of the main problems with only thinning forests to reduce fuels is that it can often leave residues, actually increasing surface fuels. Prescribed burning can significantly reduce litter and surface fuels, reducing fire intensity. So all of that stuff that's left on the ground after you thin, that can, under some circumstances, pose a significant fire hazard if you don't follow it up with a prescribed burn to clean that up. And secondly, the ecological benefits are most likely to be realized if you follow that thinning treatment with a prescribed fire. This other study says that neither burning nor thinning alone significantly increased understory plant richness, or cover. Thinning increased richness and cover, but only when followed by fire. So thinning is important. It can be a lot of work. It's good to do it. But if you have the possibility to follow it up with prescribed fire, then we know that that is certainly the most effective combination. You don't always need to thin before doing prescribed fire. I don't want to leave that impression either. But if your forest looks like this, it hasn't had any work done in 20 or 30 years or more, the chances are that you'll need to do a little bit of mechanical work, hand piling or something like that before you can get a prescribed fire in here. But that's not always the case. In some cases, if you have oak woodlands or some fairly mature stand, it's possible to do an underburn without prior thinning. So that will depend on your particular circumstances. Another thing people are worried about is the attitude of neighbors. Aren't people going to complain, right? And I want to reassure you that most people are very favorable to prescribed fire. We've never found a survey anywhere, actually in the United States, that found lower than 80% approval for prescribed fire. So if you stop people on the street and you ask them if they approve of prescribed fire and they think it's important, the vast majority of people will agree with that. So, of course, the support that people have for prescribed fire will depend on the trust in those who are burning. And so it's an important thing to talk to your neighbors. You don't want to surprise people, right, with a column of smoke. People have obviously been through a lot. There's a lot of trauma associated with seeing smoke and wildfires. And one of the important things with being sensitive toward that is making sure that people have the information ahead of time. They have the sense that they can, control their environment and not be surprised by something suddenly happening, right? And so maybe even they want to go away for the day if you're going to plan a prescribed burn, or maybe they want to come and observe it. A last question is that people ask, isn't it very, very complicated to do a prescribed fire? I mean, we're talking about engines and thinning and a lot of work. Well, the reality is that prescribed fire, there's a whole range, right, of what prescribed fire can look like. It can look like this on the left, all the way to helicopter burning, in other environments. So somewhere in the middle, there's probably something that is realistic for your land. So how do you actually get prescribed fire on your land? There are 4 options that we're going to talk about. The first is hiring a contractor. The second is getting help from agencies. The third is doing it yourself. And the last is the prescribed burn associations that Erin is going to discuss. So the first option, in some ways, it's the easiest, certainly if you can afford it, is to hire a contractor. We have great contractors here in Southwest Oregon. We're quite lucky that way. And if you hire a contractor, some of the pros are that they will take on the liability. They are insured. Hopefully, there's some policy issues there with insurance companies not wanting to extend coverage to prescribed fire that we're dealing with right now. But generally speaking, these contractors will have insurance. They're highly experienced. They know what they're doing. They have all the equipment and the personnel. You basically don't have to do anything. Of course, the cons are that it's going to cost quite a bit. They might not be available. They're in high demand. And it's also not going to be very useful for small areas, which we'll get into in a minute. So what is the cost? So there are several steps. First of all, you have to prepare a fire line, which is a dug mineral, bare dirt line that goes around the entire perimeter of the burn, unless you happen to have a road or some other natural break. And to hire somebody to dig line for you is probably going to cost 60 to 90 cents per foot. Then you're going to have a burn boss come out and write the burn plan. That's going to cost about $1,000 to $1,500. And then the actual burn itself is going to cost about $400 to $500 per acre. And the thing is that there's a 20-acre minimum for these contractors, because they have to bring the same amount of personnel and equipment to do 5 acres as they do for 20 acres. There's basically a minimum level that they need to have to do a burn, right? So that's why I said earlier that it's not going to be so useful for smaller acreages. If you want to burn a couple acres or 5 acres, it's probably not going to be as cost effective. So as an example, you want to do a 20-acre prescribed burn, 1,867 feet of line. I made that as I put that in the example because that's half of a 20-acre square. So I'm assuming that you maybe have some road around part of it. That's going to fetch you about $12,000. So, and then you're probably going to have to do that every 5 to 10 years. So it ends up being quite expensive and probably not accessible for very many people. The next option is to get help from agencies. In some circumstances, if you have property adjacent to federal lands like BLM and Forest Service, there are situations in which they might do a burn across from their side of the fence onto your land. There are various types of agreements that exist to make this possible. So if you're lucky enough, I suppose, to be against public land, that could be something to look into. And in some cases, local fire departments might be interested in putting on a training burn, in which case you get some fire done on your land and they get some training and everybody's happy. That is probably a long shot, but I've heard of that happening. Now, there are other forms of assistance that agencies can provide, such as technical assistance or funding. We have the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that can help you with some of the wildlife aspects of your forest management. The Natural Resources Conservation Service has funding for forest management practices, thinning and burning. ODF, the Oregon Department of Forestry, has stewardship foresters who can help you create a plan for your land and learn about funding opportunities. And of course, we at OSU Extension also support landowners and provide technical assistance. So those organizations aren't necessarily going to do a burn for you, but they can provide you with information and sometimes funding for projects. One thing that I'll mention real quick is that there are project areas in the Jackson and Josephine counties and elsewhere. There are project areas where the agencies tend to focus their funding, particularly the NRCS. And so if you happen to be within one of those project areas, then you certainly should take advantage of that opportunity. They have cost share programs where they'll fund a certain amount per acre for you to do the work. For example, right now, we have the West Bear project area, which is essentially between Jacksonville and Talon on the east side of that ridge. And a lot of these partners are coming together, a lot of these agencies and contractors to do work throughout that area. So if you're in that area, for example, that would be a good opportunity to take advantage of their funding. If you're not in a project area, then there might not be quite as much funding, but those organizations, those agencies can help you figure out if there's something for you. So the pros are working with agencies. Again, you don't have to do anything. They may provide some liability protection, but the cons are that actually getting agencies to come and burn your land is probably a long shot. You're probably going to have to wait a long time unless you happen to be in one of these project areas and there is funding and contractors available to do that work. Our third option is that you can do it yourself. Well, of course, it takes a certain level of experience to be able to do this, but it's not unheard of. These photos here on the right are photos of a property in the Applegate Valley. Again, a lot of my photos are from the Applegate Valley. This is Rich Fairbanks's property. You may know Rich because he's a contributor to the Land Stewards, and he's a retired firefighter, so he has a certain level of experience, and he goes around burning little pieces of his land a little bit at a time every year. He's previously thinned the forest, so you can see that there's very low levels of fuel. He can light a fire at the deer path above and kind of burn down the hill very gently to another deer path. So it's very low intensity stuff that he does in winter when the moisture is relatively high. And that's how he is able to do that. So of course the pros are, if you're doing it yourself, you don't have to rely on anybody else's schedules. It doesn't cost you necessarily anything beyond, you might want to get some equipment. Of course, the cons are that you need to have experience at some level and training. You might need help from your friends and family. That might be a pro or a con. It might be a nice thing to get people together to do. And it's probably only going to work for small, low complexity areas during the off season. So basically burns under 2 acres. Once you start going above 2 acres, you need a burn permit from ODF, and they're going to require a lot more resources and other forms of preparation. So, and also if you're doing it yourself, you don't have the benefit of assistance from others who have experience and who know how to put together a burn plan and obtain permits. So there's going to certainly be a learning curve. And this is where prescribed burn associations come into play. And so I'll turn this over to Erin at this point. And I also want to remind you that you can put your questions in the chat and we will get to them at the end. So, Erin, it's all yours. Whew. I thought I put Erin to sleep there for a second. Whew.
Yeah. Did you hear me that it appears that screen sharing has been disabled?
Oh, I will enable that.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris, for that great introduction. Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Wayne. And thank you for everyone attending for showing your interest in prescribed burning by being here tonight. My name's Aaron Krikova. I'm the organizer of the Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association. I started working in forestry in the Rogue Valley in 2005, working for a small company. We did a little bit of small diameter thinning, but mostly we worked with fuel reduction. Pretty standard mechanical thinning using chainsaws to pile brush, burn it. It was really wonderful work. I was learning about the ecology of the forest, making the forests healthier, helping make people's land safer. I worked in this profession for around 10 years and really enjoyed it. But after 10 years, I started to realize that some of these projects that I had worked on, the brush and the trees were coming back to almost the same levels they had been at when I had initially done all of this work. So some other landowners started to inquire with me about what exactly they could do to try and keep their lands healthier, because it's really expensive to do mechanical fuel reduction work, and trying to have that cost every 7 to 10 years was prohibitive. So while I was trying to figure out a solution to this, I was reminded of a small project I had done in 2007. This project had been in the works for about 7 years. The fuel reduction had been done. Some small diameter thinning was performed. Some trees were pulled out. And then we had a prescribed burn. I had never experienced anything like that before. The fire department was there, some BLM employees, the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, and we lit the forest on fire. It was really quite a sight to behold. After that time, I had been involved in a couple very small, maybe 100-foot by 100-foot burns where we had reduced some blackberries, or one of my coworkers wanted to do a small burn on his property. So maybe a half a dozen or a dozen of us got together and helped him. But I hadn't really done anything on a larger scale. And I knew that if we were going to use this as a maintenance tool for landowners, I had to get more experience. So I signed up for a program called Trex, Prescribed Fire Training Exchange, that was hosted by the Nature Conservancy. They hold these programs all across the country and even the world at this point. But there's one that's held in Ashland every few years. So I signed up. I had to jump through a lot of hoops and actually become a qualified wildland firefighter, take the arduous pack test, and essentially become a firefighter. But for 2 weeks, I learned all about prescribed burning. I met a lot of really interesting, fascinating people who were very passionate about prescribed burning, and realized that if I was going to be interested in prescribed burning and really do this seriously, I needed to change careers. So I stopped doing fuel reduction work and I became a wildland firefighter. I realized I really enjoyed it and was really glad that I had changed careers. But after having done it for a few years, I realized that I wasn't actually accomplishing the thing that I had set out to do, which was to figure out how to do more prescribed burning on private lands in order to help maintain safe fuel loads. So at the second Trex, I heard about this concept of prescribed burn associations, which in essence was this idea of having community members work together to do prescribed burning on their own lands. The concept originated in the Midwest, and usually with, ranchers and farmers who would get together to burn each other's properties, kind of the way we think of barn raising or haying. It's a classic rural neighbors helping neighbors kind of process. You can see from this map, most prescribed burn associations in the United States are in the Midwest. There's a small clustering in North Carolina and a small clustering in northern Florida. But you can also see there's now over 20 prescribed burn associations in California. The first prescribed burn association in California was started in 2017. So in 5 years, there's now over 20 prescribed burn associations. This is obviously an idea with a lot of oomph and a lot of good things going on. The Rogue Valley Prescribed Burn Association will be the first prescribed burn association in Oregon. So mostly private landowners are the real core of what creates a prescribed burn association. But often there's other nonprofit organizations involved. Sometimes a prescribed burn association is a nonprofit organization, but not always. Often there's wildland firefighters who are involved. Sometimes local fire departments will lend a hand where they can. And then federal and state agencies like ODF or the BLM or the Forest Service are also sometimes involved in prescribed burn associations. But again, private landowners and other interested community members are the primary driving factor behind a prescribed burn association. So with this idea of a prescribed burn association, I wrote an article in the Applegator in 2019, putting out the idea to local community members that maybe we should try and form a prescribed burn association here in the Rogue Valley. I had a smattering of responses and reached out to those landowners, and they all seemed fairly interested in trying to get something like this going in our community. I wrote some burn plans and we were prepared to start doing burns in the spring of 2020. However, COVID struck, and the idea of having large groups of people together who didn't know each other was pretty much verboten. And so we put off our plans for a year, and then in the spring of 2021, rebooted the idea and tried to move forward with it. It was actually a huge success. We had over 20 people at each of the 2 burns that we performed. We had professional wildland firefighters bring fire engines and some of their expertise. We had multiple nonprofit organizations send some of their representatives. Everyone had an incredibly fun time. People who had never touched a drip torch before had an opportunity to put fire on the ground. This was only 6 months after the Almeida fire, and there was a lot of fear that just around fire in general. And multiple people expressed to me that being in this environment and seeing fire used as a tool and seeing how controllable and manageable it was really helped cure a lot of their PTSD around fire in general, which was a side effect that we hadn't really considered, but it was really wonderful to hear that. Our second prescribed burn was actually at Rich Fairbanks, who Chris already mentioned, at his property. He's done a lot of burning previously, but this was the largest chunk of land he had ever gotten to do all at once. And he was really ecstatic about the effects. So let's talk about how the process works in general. Oh, I forgot to mention, we had a lot of really good media coverage. We had a front page of the Sunday paper in the Mail Tribune, a really positive and supportive editorial, and a front page article in the Applegator. So there was a lot of interest from the media. JPR wanted to do an interview with me, but I couldn't get it to work out with my firefighting schedule. So hopefully this coming spring, I'll have an opportunity on the radio with them. So how does the whole process work? The initial process is for me to go, or someone else to go and do a site visit of a property and to evaluate whether it would be an appropriate spot to do a prescribed burn for the PBA. Generally, we're looking at what kind of fuel loads we have. As Chris mentioned, thinning isn't necessarily the first step, but most land in our area does need to have an initial fuel treatment done, with ladder fuels being reduced and a lot of the brush component removed before it's safe to get control there on the. We also want to look at road rails and use as control lines. This really helps reduce the amount of initial effort that's required to create control lines around the project site. Also, access to the site. Is it way deep in the boonies? Is it hard to get to? Or can we drive fire engines there and have access? Once we've selected a site and decided that it's appropriate for a burn, then we work on the burn plan. Burn plans can be 20 pages or they can be 60 pages. I've seen the whole range. It kind of depends on who's writing the plan, what their intention is, what agency or contractor they work for. But distilled down, it essentially lists the location of the burn. It includes maps showing which area is going to be burned, an explanation of why we're burning that area and what sort of desired outcomes we have. This might be as simple as reduce hazardous fuels, or it might be as specific as reduce 10-hour fuels by 60%. Then there's usually a prescription which describes the actual weather conditions we need in order to do a safe burn, and then emergency information in case someone should hurt themselves and needs to be taken to the hospital. This is an example of a standard prescription. It's pretty common for this area. It lists the temperature, the humidity, the wind speeds, and direction that are needed to get the flame lengths that we would like in order to accomplish our goals for this particular project. Too hot and too dry, we're going to have higher longer flame lengths than we desire, too cool, too humid, we're not actually going to be able to get the fire to carry on the ground. Now, there's a little bit of leeway here. It could be a little hotter and a little drier, or a little wetter and a little hotter. But as long as we're kind of in this range, we know that we'll get good fire effects. The wind direction is important to help us understand which direction the smoke is going to carry. We live near a smoke sensitive receptor area, which is essentially the whole Bear Creek area. And so we really want to make sure we don't get any smoke drifting into that area. Once we have our burn plan developed, now we contact ODF. This is pretty simple and straightforward. We give them a call, tell them the address, they give us a good time to meet them, and they come out, review the area, we explain to them what we're planning on doing, and then they write us a permit. Once we have the permit in hand, now we look at the long-term forecast and try and watch out for a good weather window where we'll be able to hit that perfect window of the right temperature and the right humidity and the right wind conditions that we can do the burn successfully and safely. Once we've located a good weather window, about a week in advance, we like to let the participants know that there's an upcoming possible burn day and to be prepared. Then about 3 or 4 days before this day, we reach out to the National Weather Service and ask for a spot weather forecast. This is easily done on their website, and it essentially asks for specific forecasts for temperature, humidity, and wind over a current period of time for a very specific area. They usually get these spot weather forecasts back in 6 to 12 hours. So with this in hand, we know that, okay, we are going to have the right humidities and the right temperatures to do this burn successfully. If everything looks good and we think it's going to be a go, now we let the fire districts know, because they're going to get a lot of phone calls about smoke, and they really like to know ahead of time that it's not a fire that they need to respond to. In addition, if there's any community phone trees in the area, we like to reach out to them and let them know as well. This connects back to the idea of letting your neighbors know what's going to happen so they're not afraid or scared that the smoke they see is a new wildfire starting. It's all about respect and communication. And the day before our burn, we register with Oregon Department of Forestry Smoke Management to make sure we're not filling the air with too much smoke that might become hazardous to community members. This is another very simple form, basically lists the location, the amount of smoke we're going to put into the air, and the reason why we're doing the burn. Once we've done all of this, now it's time for the fun. Burn day. There's a few more things we do on the day of the burn, like we take some weather readings actually on site at the location across the time that we're doing the burn to make sure we're not getting outside of that prescription. We might rake back some of the duff around the individual trees to help protect them. And after the burn is complete, we go back in and put out any hot embers or flames that are remaining within the burn site to make sure that the fire doesn't get outside of our control area after everybody goes home. I know that all seems like a lot, and I'm sure many of you are asking yourselves, is all of this really necessary? And the short answer is no, it's not all necessary. I know people like Chris had mentioned, Rich Fairbanks, who do small, maybe 100-foot by 100-foot areas by themselves under just the right conditions, or maybe do a little bit of blackberry burning here and there. But most of those people are experienced wildland firefighters who have some idea about this whole process and how it works. And again, they're doing very small areas. If you're trying to burn more than 2 acres, you have to have a permit from ODF. If you're burning more than 10 tons of smoke, you have to have a permit from smoke management. If you're trying to do larger scale burns, you're going to need help. You're going to need resources. And in addition, the reason we do all of these things is to help cover the L word, liability. Everybody's concerned about it. And luckily we live in Oregon, which is a simple negligence state. which essentially means if you've done everything a reasonable person would do and fire still gets away, you still won't be held liable for it. The way an insurance agent explained it to me once was, if someone is watering their lawn in the summer and someone walks by and slips and falls, that person won't be held liable because watering your lawn in the summer is totally reasonable. If you're watering your lawn in the winter, someone comes by and slips and falls, you'll probably be held liable because it's completely irresponsible and unreasonable to be watering your lawn in the winter. So having permits in place, having a burn plan, doing a spot weather check, having resources and equipment on hand, all of these things go towards showing that you're being reasonable and taking reasonable care in doing this burn. So what do we have planned for the spring of 2022? We have 2 burns fully planned out, one on Wayne Iba's property, who's hosting tonight, and another one closer to Grants Pass. We have a couple of other burn sites that we're working towards, and hopefully we'll develop the burn plans and have those in place if we have good weather windows for that. The Rogue Valley PBA has started to get some grant support, primarily to discuss and organize around the idea of a PBA and to create a website for the PBA. We're still struggling to find grant support to actually do implementation or to help support my time writing burn plans and doing outreach, but hopefully that will change. We have multiple applications in the works currently, a small grant with OWEB, another grant with the Soil and Water Conservation District, and another upcoming grant through the BLM that hopefully will be able to provide some money to fund some implementation and help fund a burn boss, have some engine support, as well as fund some firefighters to do some of the mop-up work after the burning is complete. I hope I've answered some of your questions. I look forward to answering some of the ones that you've posted in your chat. And if you're interested in getting involved, please email me at roguevalleypba@gmail.com. And thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you, Aaron. And I'm just gonna put a slide up now with our contact information. And like Aaron said, we're happy to take your questions. Yeah, so, with our contact information, what are you supposed to do with that? Basically, you can reach out to either of us if you want to observe a burn or participate in a training burn, or if you're interested in hosting a burn on your land. Aaron, I just want to say very quickly too, Aaron mentioned the Trex prescribed fire training. There is one planned for this spring. Hopefully, we're planning it, and we're watching out with the COVID situation and everything, so we're having to be flexible. But there is a plan for that to happen too, and so that will be another opportunity for people to get involved with prescribed fire in the near future. I see a question, in fact, about Trex. Can anyone attend Trex? Yes, anyone can attend Trex. You need to be able to attend Trex, you need to go through the basic training that wildland firefighters go through, and that involves some online classes about fire behavior and how the organization that firefighters use works. It's called the Incident Command System, and then you have to do an arduous pack test, it's called. So you put a pack on, it weighs 45 pounds, and you have to walk, I believe, if I remember right, it is 3 miles in 45 minutes or something like that. So you kind of have to walk a little bit, fast. And that's because, you know, that the number one cause of injury on prescribed fires is actually not people getting burned or any of that. It's really people who have who overexert themselves. It can be quite physical, you know, at times, and then people will suffer some health problems related to that. So to become a firefighter, you essentially have to show that you can hike 3 miles with 45 pounds on your back.
I would like to add one thing to that, Chris.
Mhm.
I would say anybody can apply to attend Trex. They don't always accept everybody who applies. Even 2 years ago, my application was rejected. So they have limited slots, and not everybody who applies can attend. And it also often costs around $400. So you actually pay to do work for 2 weeks. But yes, and it's about 30 hours, I would say, of online training in order to go through all of the classes.
Yeah. So this is one of the reasons that we're hopeful that the Prescribed Burn Association will give people an opportunity to, you know, see a burn, be part of a burn without going through all of that just for a day's hanging out on a burn, basically. Yeah. And it used to be that with Trex, you know, there was lodging and food was provided. So for, you know, $300 or whatnot for 2 weeks, that was, you know, maybe justified. Now everything's changing a little bit because we're moving towards a different model. And so there's a lot of questions. The Trex model is being adapted, you know, because of COVID and because of the new situation that we're in. So those things are all evolving. I see Kai. Hey, Kai. Kai is willing to support making a website for the PBA. That's pretty awesome. I'm wondering if anybody else has any questions I want to go over in the chat. Somebody asked about, wait a minute, you don't need a permit if you're burning under 2 acres. And I just want to clarify about that. In Jackson County, if you're burning less than 2 acres and less than 10 tons of material, then you do not need a burn permit from ODF or go through ODF whatsoever. They will not work with you because they work with sort of more larger scale operations, right? But what you need to do is call the county burn line, and you will hear a recording that'll tell you today is, you know, open and barrel burning is permitted today in Jackson County or is not permitted today. And that's because of a forecast for the weather and whether the smoke is going to clear or if it's going to go down into the valley and smoke people out. So you just need to follow those regulations. If you're in another county, smoke management is different in different counties. And so Josephine County, for example, doesn't have a burn line. You need to get in touch with your local fire department, and they will let you know the process. And if you're in another county, I am not entirely sure. It's quite the mess of different local regulations out there. So that's the best of my knowledge. If you have specific questions about specific counties, I'm happy to do some homework and figure that out. So just email me and I can find that information. I'm seeing also, is there a list of possible contractors? In order for that, I will say you need to go to the website, My Southern Oregon Woodlands, and there are contractors listed on there. I am not sure that prescribed fire is a category that you can browse contractors by on that website, though. So it's a good website for forestry practices. I think that, and you know, we at Extension obviously can't recommend specific contractors, but I don't think there are that many. Aaron, could you help me out? Like, can we list all of the contractors right now to answer this question by by Tom?
The only two that I've heard of ever doing them are grayback and firestorm.
Okay, there you go. Grayback and firestorm. Oregon woods in the Eugene area, but I don't know if they would come down here. So
and firestorm is
not that many.
No, Lomakatsi subcontracts to grayback to do their prescribed burning.
And Lomakatsi doesn't, they're not contractors in that same way with individual landowners. They work within project areas. So it's a bit of a different business model. You can't just call them up. Let me see. I'm seeing another question. Separate from weather conditions, what types of areas are not appropriate for prescribed burn? That's a good question. In this part of the state, I would say that probably every area used to burn more frequently than it does now. I'm speaking about Southwest Oregon here. And so most areas, fire is appropriate. I think that it depends on a few things. Like some people are concerned about using fire in riparian zones, for example, particularly when you have invasive plants like blackberries that burn very differently. So you kind of got to look out for stuff like that. Is there an invasive species that is going to respond to fire in a way that you don't like? That would be one of my concerns. Obviously, as we've discussed, some places need specific types of work to be done before you can do a prescribed burn. You might need to do thinning before you can do a prescribed burn. If you have big, old legacy ponderosa pines or sugar pines, without fire for 150 years, a lot of them have built up a very thick mat of material around the base. And if that smolders over a period of time, it could kill those trees. So you might need to go and rake around some of those trees to kind of get some of that mound of material away to make sure you're not cooking the roots. So there are certain things like that that we do to make sure that we're having the right impact. But I can't think of an area that should be off limits entirely. Aaron?
No, I agree with your assessment. There is some maybe riparian areas where it would be very difficult to find a burn window where it would actually burn, but a lot of those areas that are kind of excluded from normal fuel reduction work become wicks when a wildfire actually does occur. And so getting fire into those riparian areas is actually something that I would like to see more of where possible.
Mm-hmm. And I agree that some places are going to be tricky because of the weather conditions and when fire season is. So higher elevation meadows, unfortunately, it's tricky because they have snow late in the season, and then they declare fire season because at lower elevations things are drying out. But meanwhile, it hasn't even melted or dried out properly in higher elevations to be able to do a burn there. And so that's a problem right now, is that we declare fire season everywhere. When really we're concerned about lower elevations. And that means that, some of these higher elevation places don't get good windows.
So it looks like there's a few PBA questions that I can answer.
Mm-hmm.
So is a PBA considered a nonprofit organization? It can be, but not all of them are. The Rogue Valley PBA is not an official nonprofit organization currently, although in the future we may be moving towards that. So no, a PBA does not have to be a nonprofit organization. Many of them are not, while some of the larger, more organized ones are. A PBA would help with burning in meadows and wetlands. We're not strictly focused on woodlands. Again, as Chris mentioned, fire traveled across all of this landscape in different return intervals at different times. And so anywhere where fire can do good on the ground, the PBA would love to be involved in that. Bud, it sounds like you have fuel reduction needs around mechanical fuel reduction to begin with. And so I would recommend reaching out to the OSU Extension or ODF to try and find funding for the fuel reduction portion of what needs to be done on your property. And once the fuel reduction has been performed, then it's possible that the PBA could get involved and try and get some good fire on the ground for you. Our PBA has not done any partnership with the tribes. The Siskiyou Prescribed Burn Association just over the border has been involved with burning with the tribes. Do you want to talk about the highly invasive plant species, Chris?
Sure, yeah, and I mean about the connection to indigenous burning, I think that, you know, that's a really good point. And of course, we recognize that the use of prescribed fire is something that comes from indigenous knowledge. You know, that's where the roots of this practice are. And so certainly it's important to respect that. And you know, if there are situations under which we can respectfully engage with tribal fire practitioners in this region, we will do that. You know, and like Aaron said, in California, tribes have been a really huge part of making change and supporting the use of prescribed fire across all jurisdictions. So yeah, and then about the plants, we have good examples of using fire to eliminate certain invasive plants like yellow star thistle, Medusa head, which is an invasive annual grass, and various other annual grasses. You know, when they grow and they are starting to make seed, and you burn them right at the time when those seeds are just ripening, you can wipe them out because they don't have seeds in the soil, seed bank in the soils, and particularly annual grasses. And so at that point, if you burn a well-timed burn can eliminate that invasive plant. The trick is that means burning probably in June or maybe July. And right now, a lot of people are concerned about, obviously that's fire season. And so you need a lot more resources and you need ODF to give you the blessing. So there are a few reasons why we're not using that tool quite as much as it could be. Brent is asking about possible changes in Oregon laws and legislation that small forest landowners should be on the lookout for. Right now, that there are a few things going on that could be of interest. Where there's a study bill that was introduced that passed, and so now they're studying the question of liability and insurance to understand how changes to Oregon's liability statutes could increase the use of prescribed fire, particularly a shift to a status called gross negligence. So under gross negligence, instead of proving that somebody was just negligent, you have to show that they were willfully negligent or malicious in their intent. And so that raises the bar in terms of proving that somebody, you know, was wrongful in the event of a fire escaping. And that's something that's being studied. Maybe it's going to happen in a few years. They first have to study it, and then there's going to be some sort of bill introduced to enact those solutions. Another thing that's happening is there is the Certified Burn Manager program that is going through the planning stages right now. And what that means is that there will be a system for people outside of the federal system to get fire qualifications, prescribed fire qualifications. So right now, the system, the federal qualification system that is used in WCG, people go into that and they start at basic firefighter type 2 and then type 1, and then you have various qualifications, and then eventually people can become burn bosses. Well, it takes about 8 years of somebody fighting fires, you know, professionally to become a burn boss. So right now, that's a real problem, that we are not able to get people certified without spending basically a career in wildland firefighting. So the state level certified burn manager program does provide that opportunity for people to work on developing qualifications without having to necessarily pursue a career as wildland firefighters. So that will be exciting, and it will open doors for more people to become state certified burn bosses. And is there anything else? There's various funding opportunities. You know, I think the state is taking very seriously the problem of fire now, I'd like to think. And so also we have seen some new funding opportunities, and hopefully that will carry forward and benefit small woodland owners. Autumn is asking about herbicides, and I have to admit that that is beyond my area of expertise. When should you treat before, during, or after thinning, pile burning, or prescribed fire? Yep, I would have to say I'm sorry, that is beyond my area of expertise. But we have other people at Extension who might be able to answer that question, or ODF. My guess would be that it's going to depend a lot on your situation. I mean, if you have what sorts of species you're talking about, what sort of ecosystem you're in, and how prevalent these species are. So I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in on that one. Medusa head in the high desert. Okay. Yeah. If you want to reach out, send me an email. I can figure out somebody who can answer that question, but that person is not me. I'm going to put my email in right now, in fact, if that's useful. All right, I'm not seeing.
I see that
Marcy?
Brett is asking, as small forest owners, are there possible changes in Oregon laws and legislation that we should be looking out for? That was another question in the chat.
That's the one that I was addressing with the Certified Burn Manager program,
okay.
The liability and insurance changes.
Okay.
And let me see, I think those are the ones that are most likely to be impactful in the near future. And like I said, funding opportunities are changing, and there are more funding opportunities through ODF. So that's also another situation. You might want to reach out to your stewardship forester to ask about funding opportunities. And then there are also Firewise communities, which is a program that is also through ODF, which could be able to help. I heard the ODF recently hired a fuels reduction crew that will go around doing fuel reduction for high priority areas, and particularly people who aren't able, for whatever reason, to do it themselves, you know, because they may be elderly or for whatever reason. So I think that's going to be a great thing too, to get more just hands on deck and increase that capacity. In fact, next time we should invite ODF. I keep saying you should contact ODF for this and that. We should just have them here. But I imagine the land stewards have had opportunities to interact with ODF. I don't know.
Yes, that is a great idea. But you did mention Firewise USA, and I want to remind you again that on March 9th, Herb Johnson of Firewise USA will give a class at the same time.
Now, Herb Johnson, he will know about the different pots of money. That's great that you're talking to him.
Okay.
Somebody's asking, Wayne's asking, why is there a blanket prohibition on burns November through February in the Ashland area? So yes, that is in the air quality management area, which is basically the Bear Creek Valley. And that's simply for air quality reasons, right? So unfortunately, the way that the landscape is, the topography, the smoke tends to collect in the low-lying areas. And, if you don't have good ventilation, then it can just sit there for a long time. And that causes, obviously, serious problems for people. Smoke is unfortunately quite unhealthy. I'm sure you've all experienced some of that in the last year, and so that's the rationale for that. Hopefully, if you're ready, by the time March comes around and you have piles and you have other things to burn, March will still have some good burn windows for you.
Great. Does anyone else have any other questions to add to the chat before we adjourn? We'll give a few more minutes for you to think of some more questions.
Erin, do you want to just put your email in the chat for anybody who wants to contact you about the PBA?
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you everybody for your attendance and your commitment to good land management.
Chris and Erin, thank you so much. This is very informative and well organized, and we really appreciate it. And thank you all for attending. And as you saw in the slides at the beginning, please do keep in mind going to our website, OSU Land Steward Program, to look for future classes. And we